Welcome to the deep dive. We take your sources, your notes, research, all that stuff, and, well, we find the core ideas.
Yeah.
It's really about getting you up to speed quickly, understanding complex topics without drowning in the detail.
That's the goal.
And today, we're jumping into something pretty deep. The nature of freedom. The mind itself, really. We're looking at it mainly through J. Krishnamurti's teachings,
Right.
based on the sources you sent over.
Right, but also bring in some important commentary and critiques, too. It's not just one perspective.
Exactly. We've got talks, articles, discussions, all exploring Krishnamurti's ideas on things like, control, conflict, desire, time, knowledge, big topics.
Huge.
But crucially, we're also looking at reflections on his approach,
Mm.
Where people might challenge it or see limitations.
And our mission here for this deep dive, it's kind of twofold. First, really get our heads around Krishnamurti's main points, this idea of the occupied mind, what he meant by real freedom, and just how hard psychological change actually is. But second, and this is just as important, we need to properly look at the other viewpoints, the critiques that are in these materials too. Give them their due weight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So think of this like we're exploring together, not a lecture, more like using these ideas as a mirror, maybe, seeing what resonates, what feels challenging, what actually sparks some insight for you and your own experience, not just, intellectual concepts.
Right, beyond the theory.
Okay, let's dive in then. Where do the sources suggest we start? What's the sort of fundamental observation about our minds?
Well, the very first thing they hit on is this idea that if you really look, your mind is just always busy, always occupied. It's never just quiet on its own, is it? Not without, massive effort. It's this constant chatter, thoughts, memories, plans, worries, desires, contradictions. It's just humming along all the time.
Constantly full. And how do the sources connect that state, that busyness, to the whole idea of freedom?
Well, that's the absolute core link. The argument is a mind that's perpetually filled up, sort of possessed by all this stuff, ideas, knowledge from the past, chasing pleasure, running from fear, holding on to sorrow. That mind, it just isn't free.
Because it's full.
Because it's full. It's full of the past or projecting into the future. It means it can't really be fully here. Then that leads straight to the big question. What actually is freedom then?
Because it's definitely not just about, say, political freedom or being able to do whatever you feel like doing externally.
Yeah.
That's not what they're getting at.
No, exactly. That's the outward stuff. Important, sure. But this deep dive, it's focused squarely on the inward state. Psychological freedom. What does it mean to be free inside your own head?
Okay.
And Krishnamurti's take on this, highlighted in the sources, it's pretty radical. He talks about freedom as the total letting go, the complete denial of all inward psychological authority.
Wow, all inward authority. What does that even mean?
Think about it not relying on anything inside your mind that tells you how to think or feel. No gurus, no traditions shaping you psychologically, not even relying on the authority of your own past experiences or conclusions.
So even my own memory can be an authority.
Yes, that's the idea. Relying on any of that, internal or external, makes you, in his terms, kind of secondhand. You're living based on what you've been told or what you already know or concluded. You're not seeing things directly, freshly. You're referencing the known, so you're not truly free.
Okay, I think I see. So how does that reliance, leaning on authority, even our own past,
Yeah.
how does that actually stop us seeing something new?
Well, because authority, almost by definition, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
a person, a book, a belief, or that fixed image you have of yourself in the past, it's all rooted in the known, in history.
Right.
It gives you answers based on what's already happened or been decided. So a mind that's conditioned to follow an authority or maybe imitate some past ideal, it's like it's wearing blinders. It can only see through the filter of what it already accepts or knows. The sources suggest that real seeing, real learning, it needs a mind that isn't already cluttered with answers, not burdened by the past or tradition.
And this lack of inner freedom, this being tied to the known, seems really connected to conflict in the sources. You just see something powerful like, the end of conflict is freedom.
Yes, that's a huge theme. Conflict, we tend to just accept it, don't we? The struggle to become better, the fight against things we don't like in ourselves or the world.
Yeah, it seems normal.
But these materials argue that conflict comes from division, fundamentally. Not just us versus them out there, but division inside.
Inside, like what?
Like when you identify really strongly with a belief, a nation, a group, or even just a fixed idea of who I am, you draw a line, you create a separation. Me versus not me, or me versus my anger. And the sources are really clear. Where there's separation, division, inward or outward, there has to be conflict. That separation is the battleground.
Okay, so conflict stems from division, which is tied to relying on the past, wanting to become something else.
Yeah.
How does time fit into all this? The sources mention different kinds of time.
Right. Yeah, they distinguish. There's physical time, clock time, needed to catch a train, plan your day, obvious, and biological time we age, seasons change, plants grow. That's factual, necessary.
Okay.
But the really crucial concept, and maybe the most challenging, is what they call psychological time.
Psychological time.
Yeah. Defined as that movement in the mind from what is right now to what should be or what I want to become later.
The becoming thing again.
Exactly. I am this, but I need time to become that calmer, wiser, less anxious, whatever. And almost all our conditioning, our culture tells us change takes time, right? You practice, you work at it, you gradually improve over time.
That sounds normal. How else would it work?
Well, here's the radical part. The sources argue that psychological time isn't just unhelpful, it's actually dangerous. An illusion even.
Dangerous. Why?
Because, they argue, it stops you from acting now. If you say, I'm angry, but I'll deal with it, I need time to overcome it, what are you actually doing in that interval?
Still being angry.
Exactly. You're perpetuating the anger. The idea is there's no actual psychological tomorrow where you'll magically be free of it, that future state you're aiming for. It's just a concept created by thought. So they propose that right action, effective action, has to be action without psychological time, dealing directly with what is right now.
Whoa, okay. That feels incredibly counterintuitive. My first thought is, hang on, how can you just instantly deal with deep fear or anxiety? Don't you need time? Therapy takes time. Building habits takes time. It feels like you need a process.
And that's totally the standard view, isn't it? It's how we're conditioned, and it's something the critiques and the sources definitely pick up on later.
Right.
But from the perspective being presented here, that very belief, I need time to change, that belief itself is the thing that keeps what is going. The challenge is the idea of needing time, just thought ducking, the difficulty of looking right at the fact now.
Okay. Deep breath. Let's link this to control. The sources talk a lot about control, often framed as necessary. Control your temper, control your desires.
Yes, and the argument there is that the very act of trying to control immediately creates a split, doesn't it? There's the controller, the good part of me, the will and the control, the bad impulse, the anger, the fear.
Right, the I that must manage the it.
Precisely. I am angry and I must suppress this anger.
Right.
But where you have that split, that controller versus controlled, you automatically have conflict. The will fighting the impulse. It's an internal battle.
Yep.
And the really strong argument here is that this kind of control, it isn't real order. It actually creates distortion through conflict itself, through suppression, through forcing yourself to conform to some idea of how you should be. It just reinforces that basic division. The observer, me, and the observed, my anger.
So what's the alternative then? Just let rip.
No, not quite. Krishnamurthi poses the challenge. Can life be lived without this constant effort of control? Can order emerge not from suppression, but from a deeper understanding? The understanding that the controller is the controlled.
The controller is the controlled.
How?
Yeah.
The idea is that the part of you trying to manage the anger isn't actually separate from the anger itself. It's all part of the same movement of thought, feeling, reaction, seeing that unity dissolves the conflict, or so the argument goes.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on. Let's bring in desire and pleasure. They feel pretty fundamental, and the sources link them with fear.
Yeah, they're presented almost like two sides of the same coin, really active forces in most people's lives. The sources trace the process. You see something, you touch it or experience it, sensation arises, then desire kicks in, often boosted by the memory of past pleasure linked to it.
Like wanting that piece of cake again.
Exactly, that taste, that feeling, you want to repeat it.
And the traditional way is?
Often control or suppression. The sources mention monks wearing blinkers to avoid sights that might stir desire. But the argument against that is, well, trying to control or suppress desire doesn't actually get rid of it. It can just squeeze out energy. And the effort to control is itself another desire, isn't it? The desire to be free from desire, or the desire for control.
So it's not saying pleasure is bad. Enjoying things.
No, absolutely not. The sources are careful about that. It's about looking at the structure of desire, especially the pursuit of pleasure. They make a distinction between, say, pleasure, enjoyment, and joy. Like, seeing a beautiful sunset might bring immediate delight. That's enjoyment, maybe joy. Direct, simple. But it's the anticipation of pleasure, dwelling on the memory, wanting to replicate it, wanting to become someone who always feels that good That's where the issue lies, according to these sources.
Because it's tied to memory and the future.
Exactly. That anticipation, that pursuit based on memory and wanting it again, that's what leads to frustration and conflict if you don't get it. It pulls you out of just seeing what is right now.
Okay, so we've got this picture of a mind that's constantly busy, conditioned by time and authority, stuck in control patterns born from division, driven by pursuing pleasure based on the past. Given all that, how, according to these sources, do you actually find this inner freedom?
It keeps coming back to observation, self-awareness, but in a really specific sense.
How so?
The sources often use this metaphor of using the speaker, or this conversation even, as a mirror. Not to analyze or intellectualize, but to actually see yourself, see your mind's activity exactly as it is, without judging it, without immediately wanting to fix it.
So intense awareness.
The acute alertness, yeah. Clarity, sensitivity in the present moment. That's the emphasis.
And you mentioned it's not just thinking about it, it's seeing the fact. Can you unpack that a bit more?
This is really critical. It means staying right there with what is, seeing the fact of your anger, your envy, your fear, whatever it is, seeing it instantly, directly, without commentary, without analysis, without moving away from the raw fact of it.
Okay.
And the radical claim is that the very perception of that fact, seen clearly, totally, without trying to do anything about it, that seeing is the ending of it.
Instantly, not over time.
Instantly. It's not presented as a result of effort or time. It's in the quality, the intensity of the seeing itself. Intellectual understanding. Not enough, they say. You can understand conflict intellectually forever and still be caught in it.
Right. And this is where it really connects back to that secondhand idea, isn't it? This intense seeing feels related to freedom from the known.
Absolutely. That's a core concept. Krishnamurti, as the sources explain, makes this sharp distinction. There's functional knowledge, your name, how to drive, your job skills, necessary for survival.
Right.
But then there's psychological knowledge. Yeah. That's the pileup of past experiences, memories, the images you hold of yourself and others, your conclusions, your prejudices.
My mental baggage.
Pretty much. And this psychological knowledge is seen as basically the same thing as the past, as psychological time. And it's described as dangerous because it constantly gets in the way of seeing what is freshly, right now.
Can you give an example?
Sure. You meet someone new, but your mind immediately starts filtering them through past experiences, stereotypes, judgments you've already formed. That filter is the psychological known.
Got it.
So the sources invite you to watch this process. Experience happens, becomes knowledge, becomes memory, fuels thought, drives action based on the past. Seeing that cycle clearly, they suggest, means perception isn't weighed down by the past anymore.
Leading to action free from that burden.
Action without psychological time, yeah. Think about carrying hurt. It's often based on an image we built about ourselves from past stuff. That image is psychological knowledge, the known. Seeing the fact of that image, its constructed nature, instantly, that's key. It links to this idea of negation not acting psychologically from that old storehouse, only using necessary technical thought.
What about things like meditation? Trying to quiet the mind. Do the sources talk about that?
They do, yeah, but often quite critically of conventional methods.
Oh, how so?
Well, traditional meditation is often critiqued as being another form of becoming. You're trying to achieve a quiet state, which is still a desire. Or it involves control, forcing the mind to be still.
Right.
The sources argue neither of those leads to genuine stillness. They suggest you actually need to reject methods based on control or achievement to allow real silence to emerge. Yeah. A space where something totally new, beyond the known, might happen. It's more about inquiring into the nature of the chattering mind rather than applying a technique to stop it.
And learning itself.
Yeah.
Is that seen differently too?
Fundamentally differently. Learning, in this view, isn't about piling up more knowledge over time.
Which is how we usually think of it.
Totally. Instead, it's described as an active, present movement. The very act of observing what is right now. It requires a mind that's curious, that can say, I don't know, instead of jumping to conclusions based on past learning. A mind free from conditioning, free from the need to conform, just observing. It really challenges our usual sense of acquiring knowledge.
Okay, wow. That's a really powerful and honestly demanding perspective from Krishnamurti presented here. This focus on immediate insight, stripping away conditioning, freedom from the known.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the sources also include critiques complexities.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because it forces us to ask, is that enough? Is this immediate insight, this instantaneous seeing that ends the problem? Is that actually realistic or sufficient for most people dealing with deep psychological stuff?
Yeah, that was my earlier reaction too.
Right. Some of the commentary in these sources argues that Krishnamurti's seeming dismissal of more gradual approaches, of established methods like specific meditation techniques, or therapy like CBT, or exposure therapy might just be impractical for many people.
Can you give an example from the sources?
Yeah, they bring up the example of acrophobia, a severe fear of heights. You could have a brilliant intellectual insight that flying is safe. You might even, in a moment, see the fact of your fear clearly.
Okay.
But the sources suggest that flash of insight probably isn't enough for someone with a phobia deeply wired into their nervous system over years. Gradual exposure therapy, something Krishnamurti might have seen as incremental, time-based, is often very effective precisely because these fears are embedded much deeper than just our intellectual understanding. They're in the body, in the neurology.
So part of the critique is that maybe his approach didn't fully grapple with, say, modern neuroscience, the biological reality of conditioning.
That's definitely a key point raised, this potential blind spot. By rejecting pretty much all methods, did he overlook the real-world effectiveness of tools like MBSR or CBT for working with ingrained habits and anxieties? There's a contrast drawn sometimes with, say, certain Buddhist psychotherapies that integrate mindfulness more gradually into daily life, offering maybe a different kind of path that acknowledges the depth of conditioning.
And thinking bigger picture.
Well, the sources emphasize that change is often really complex, messy. It might require external methods, support systems, things Krishnamurti tended to reject. This feels especially relevant for people in really oppressive situations, extreme external control, rigid traditions.
Where they might not even have the space or safety for that kind of deep self-inquiry.
Exactly. Plus, the sources point out, even if you do have a powerful insight, those old biological and psychological patterns tend to creep back in, don't they? They reassert themselves, which suggests maybe some kind of ongoing practice or external support is needed to really integrate that insight and make it stick.
There was also that interesting point about Krishnamurti himself, his influences, and how strongly he denied having any.
Yes, that's explored as a complexity. The sources note that while he always insisted on independent discovery, rejecting all authority, his teachings clearly show strong parallels with other traditions, especially Buddhism and Vedanta.
So he was influenced despite saying he wasn't.
Well, it's not necessarily about invalidating his unique synthesis. It's more about highlighting how cultural and philosophical ideas can seep in, maybe even subconsciously, shaping even the most original thinkers. And it ties into that whole discussion about quoting Krishnamurti himself.
Right, is quoting him just another form of relying on authority?
Exactly. It puts his followers in a tricky position, doesn't it? If you quote the man who told you not to rely on authority, it shows just how difficult living that radical message actually is, even for those most dedicated to it.
So, wrapping this all together, what does this mean for you, listening to this? We've gone deep into these, frankly, quite challenging ideas from Krishnamurti about our busy minds, the search for freedom from conditioning, the potential illusion of psychological time, the traps of control and desire. And we've layered in those important critiques about the difficulty of instant change and the possible value of more gradual paths, given how deep our conditioning runs.
So why should you care? Why grapple with this? Because, as the sources keep saying, your personal struggles, the confusion, the anxiety, the conflict you feel inside, they aren't just yours. They're reflections of the broader human condition.
Your problems are the world's problems, in a way.
In a fundamental sense, yes, that's the perspective offered. So understanding these ideas isn't about solving some abstract puzzle. It's presented as an invitation, really, to look directly at your own mind, its activity, its patterns, its struggles for yourself.
It feels like the main invitation, especially from Krishnamurti's side in these sources, is less about finding answers or solutions out there, and more about just looking, observing the facts inside directly, without leaning on methods, gurus, beliefs, or even this conversation for the ultimate answer. Can you stand alone in that observation?
And the sources are honest, this is incredibly difficult. Our minds, they're often described as having become slow, maybe insensitive, weighed down by tradition, by the constant search to become something different. It's nearly always easier to grab onto an external system, a method, a belief. The real challenge, as presented, is cultivating that intense alertness, that sensitivity to just see what's actually happening inside right now without messing with it.
Okay. So we've taken quite a journey through these powerful ideas from Krishnamurti and also the other viewpoints of the sources you shared. We've wrestled with this idea that real freedom might mean ending conflict by being free from the psychological past, the known, the illusion of psychological time.
Right. And we've also really considered The counterarguments, the challenges of that immediate radical insight for many people, and the potential need for more gradual, structured approaches, given how deeply conditioned we are biologically and psychologically.
It doesn't necessarily lead to one simple answer, does it?
No, not at all. It presents more of a stark contrast, really, between different fundamental views on how human change and liberation happen. But running through it all, from Krishnamurti's side, is that consistent pointing back to direct observation, radical self-awareness, while the critiques urge a more nuanced view, acknowledging complexity and the potential usefulness of methods.
So reflecting on all this, here's a final thought maybe for you to take away and consider. If psychological time, that mental movement from what is now to what should be later, if that is, as suggested, an illusion created by thought, one that actually prevents immediate effective action, how might really questioning your own ingrained belief in needing time to change? How might that fundamentally shift the way you approach the very next challenge or conflict that comes up in your life?